afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to this session, the afternoon session. Dear audience, please join me welcoming Katy Hessel, the author of this fantastic book with a provocative title, The Story of Art Without Man. So I bought both editions, the English one and the German one, and you also can buy the book outside. I have to make a little bit advertising, and Katy will also sign the book, so it's a good possibility to buy it now. And I'm sure it will be a standard work for education for everyone who is interested in female art history. Okay, dear Katy, it's a great pleasure to have you here in Vienna. And many thanks also to the organizers of this festival, Humanities Festival, for bringing us together. It's really a great thing. Thank you very much. So now to your almost unbelievable book. So this was also my first reaction. The story of art without man, how can this be possible? Without Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, without Gustav Klimt, without all our famous heroes. And this book actually contains only articles of female artists, more than 350, and it begins in the 16th century and it goes up to the present day. It is divided into 5 parts, pinpointing major shifts in art history. And it goes across the globe to explore and introduce you to a myriad styles and movements, interweaving women, their works, and stories within. So in a sense, I thought it is like a female Vasari of the 21st century. So to remind, Giorgio Vasari was an Italian painter, architect, and writer, best known for his biographies of Renaissance artists. And his book was, in the middle of the 16th century, so to speak, the who is who of the 16th century. And it's also a very important work for art historians. So, if we cannot imagine an art history without male artists, it is equally impossible to imagine that female artists were excluded from art history for centuries, which, with a few exceptions, was the case. Women are completely absent from the prevailing canon of classical art literature. For example, also in Ernst Gombrich's book, The Story of Art. So Gombrich, who lived quite close to the Academy in the Gumpendorfer Straße, and Gombrich was, of course, here in the Academy. We know that he visited the Glyptothek, the Pinakothek, and he loved the place. So some circle is closing here for you today, maybe. So, Katy, I want to ask you, what was the point at which you didn't want to continue this and opened up this new perspective on art history? So what was the beginning for you?
So I've always loved art history. I was lucky enough to grow up in London, where many of the museums are free. And so what do you do on a Saturday afternoon? You go to the museums and you see art and you educate yourself. And I was lucky enough to study art history at school and also at university. And throughout that time, I, again, adored it. I thought it was the most fascinating subject in the world. The history of the world through the visual medium. The fact that these sources, these paintings that we're looking at were actually made there and then, in the Renaissance, in the neoclassical times, at the start of the Paris avant-garde, during the war. I mean, for me, when we see art, that is the excitement. It's the fact that it was made by an individual. It's their lens. And then I was at university, and at the end of my university time, I wrote a dissertation on an artist called Alice Neel. And if no one's heard of her, don't worry. She was a fantastic painter of people in America. She was born in 1900. She died in 1984. And although it might not sound groundbreaking to be a painter of people, she painted everyone who lived and shaped New York City from the 1930s to the 1980s. And actually what she showed us was a portrait of the people who lived in it. It wasn't about heralding kings and queens or people of high status or the wealthy. It was about celebrating people. And suddenly, I kind of felt seen. But what I noticed is that she died in an apartment that was stocked full of paintings. She had some recognition in her life, but only right at the end of her life did she have a glimmer of recognition. Nothing like she has today. And so I was noticing this pattern, I guess, of women either being recognized at the end of their life or perhaps after their life at all. And then I was 21 years old and I went to an art fair in London. I'm sure you have them in Vienna where dealers sell art pictures and you can see so many different artworks in one tent. Yeah. And I looked around me and I realized that I didn't see a single artwork by a woman artist. And then I had to ask myself, could I name 20 women artists off the top of my head? Could I name any pre-1900? I essentially realized that I'd been looking at art history from a male perspective. And so that night, I think it was October the 9th, 2015, I went home and I changed my life. You know, I said, I've got to dedicate myself to the rest of my life to celebrating women artists, even if it's just for me. And so I began an Instagram account. What do you do when you're 21 and you have nothing except an internet connection? That's how you have to start. I didn't have a grand room or a museum or a fantastic professor. You know, you have to start somewhere. And really, I did it for myself. And I would go around all these different museums the whole time, and I'd look at every single label, and I'd slowly educate myself about all these women artists. And then, you know, to your point earlier, when you say, how do you create an art history without men? Is it impossible? And you start to realize, well, if they left out women, then you can leave out men.
Yeah. So it's really amazing. So I can exactly follow your thoughts, because when you begins to studying female artists, it goes further and further. So there are really such a lot of them, and we must call them by their name. So this is a good idea. Do you know 20 names of female artists? So contemporary or also in history? We should make this exercise more often, not only to remember the big names of the male artists. Yeah. So what I'm wondering, how you selected those artists, more than 350. It's like a really large number, but there are currently millions or more. I even don't know, I have no idea, of female artists all over the world. How was this process to select or to choose, or did you have a team? Did you discuss how you should do it, or how can we imagine this process of?
So, I mean, when I first proposed the book, the proposal looked very different to this book. I mean, it was meant to be 30,000 words. This book is 90,000, and it got down from 120,000. Yeah. And my editor literally had to physically stop me from adding in more artists. Because when I look at this work, I almost see it, you know, it really should be kind of this thick, even thicker. It should be, you know, it should go on and on and on. Because there are millions. Yeah. And actually, you know, the wonderful but also restrictive thing about actually a book as an art form is that it has to have a structure, it has to be compact. Yeah. You have to just tell one story or a story. And I always say, this is so not the definitive art history without men. If anything, it's just what I wrote this in my mid-20s, I guess, and it was what the artists I knew about and who had spoken to me. And so what I want to almost do with this book is to say, again, your question about, can you name 20 women artists? Well, can you name 20 scientists? Can you name 20 composers, 20 film directors, right? So I want it to sort of open up these different questions. And I can't do that. And so what I hopefully want to encourage people to do is make their own. But again, it's a story of art. And I mean, I try and go around the world as much as possible with this book, but it is written in the style of Gombrich, which has its own problems in terms of the Western-focused canon. In a recent essay that I wrote for the paperback version that's just come out in the UK, I questioned this idea of beginning in the Renaissance. Where do you start? If you start a story in the Renaissance, then where does that tell us that story is going to go? How do we break down these canons that have been so entrenched in our DNA? And in terms of selecting the work, I wanted to kind of give it, as much as I would like to go back to the cave paintings and Greek art and the medieval artists, of whom I'm studying now, actually. But I wanted to also make it 500 years, because also the Renaissance, as you'll know much better than I do, art changed. It very much became about the individual. Suddenly we knew, but before, so many women, for example, worked on illuminated manuscripts. And while we have some of those names, we don't have all of them. Whereas the Renaissance was a time of humanism, individualism. And so we start actually to get the names of these women. And they were so hindered in their education. I mean, the fact that so many of these artists have to be the daughters of male artists just to become an artist because they could have access to their studio. Think about basic training like painting from life, drawing the nude figure. Women were banned from doing this until the late 1800s. And so it's really extraordinary to go back and see what they were actually able to have access to, which were themselves, so self-portraiture, portraits, but also still life. And what's extraordinary is how they played with those genres. Because when you look at, there's a fantastic artist called Clara Peters, who was living in Antwerp at the beginning of the 1600s. And what might look like these kind of beautiful, delectable still lifes on a platter, fish, chain, shells, tulips. What she actually does is she hides self-portraits in the reflections of these goblets, again to sort of show the possibilities of art and the possibilities of what I guess she was capable of.
Yeah. So I heard the word canon. This is another interesting thing. We try to deconstruct the canon, the big canon. But at the same time, what you do then, you are erecting a new canon. Are you beware of this? So which women you choose, which not? It's a process which is quite interesting, I think. And I just have to remind, we know from the 16th century that artists complained because they were not represented in Vasari's book. So did you have any reactions from female artists that said, I want to be part of your book, of this newly erected canon?
Yes, and rightly so. Especially if you're a woman, you should say, where's my place in it?
Yeah.
And so I have this Instagram account and I made it into a podcast a few years ago. So I interview artists on their careers, or artists, writers, curators, family members of the artist, on the female artist who means most to them. And it's extraordinary because what I can keep doing is creating this canon through my podcast and Instagram, which I can just do and upload. Whereas a book takes years and, it of course excludes so many people. And, I've discovered artists since I've published the book and I think, oh my gosh, how did I leave them out? Right now I'm working with the Belvedere Museum, which is near here on making an audio guide for them. I work with museums all over the world to make women artist-focused guides. And again, I've learned about so many artists I didn't know about. And so, not only is it about excluding artists working now, but also excluding artists in history. And what I hope to do in my life is kind of make volumes and volumes and volumes of this book. But what you can do with the internet is, share that work. And so not only am I learning about it, but hopefully sharing it with other people as well. I think that's so important.
So you mentioned also your podcast and your Instagram account, not to forget this, because we are discussing for years or decades this problem of female art history. But we don't reach really millions of people, but I think you can. So it's also especially to reach younger people. So it's a media that's so interesting and so important. And I have no overview how many artists you featured in your podcast, but I think that's a really, really important thing too. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm standing on the shoulders of so many people who came before me, who have, I'm so not the first person to do this. But I guess what's extraordinary about the internet is, there are many things wrong with it, but there has to be a correlation between the rise of the internet and the democratization of art, and also the celebration of different stories, because suddenly you don't necessarily have to follow a traditional route, and you can find like-minded people, and you can come together, and you can enact change through that. It is this extraordinary tool for reaching people all over the world. I never dreamt that I would be able to give a talk in Vienna, but it's kind of thanks to the internet that I can. And in a way, when we are sort of building these new canons, we have to work together in order to do that. And it does take people from all over the world contributing to that. And also, I think what's extraordinary about the internet and Instagram and the podcast and everything is also that there is no hierarchy. Okay, you can have more followers than whoever, but it doesn't actually matter. When I was younger, I met the director of Tate Modern, who was my total hero. I was completely starstruck. And I was able to go up to her and then connect with her on Instagram. And suddenly, you're able to connect with these people who you would never be able to speak to before. But now you can. And there's this kind of incredible, lack of hierarchy between it.
Did you get any training in that, or how can we imagine this? So you just started, said, okay, let's try it, and then you discovered that you reach more and more people. So
I think there's no training. I think that it's just about reaching out, and I think that if I feel like I'm going to ask someone a question that is interesting, then maybe chances are that there's one other person in the world that also might find that interesting. And I think that it's shown, people are so hungry for these subjects. And I'm very lucky because I have a lot of scholars who come on the podcast as well, so it's a great way to show their work and just celebrate people of the past.
But I can imagine that also the process of writing is different in Instagram. No, you don't write so much on Instagram, but you do. But writing a book is something else. So how do you avoid, while writing, falling into the old traps of describing women, artists, as wives, as muses, as models, or only as acquaintances of well-known male artists? Because that's what we know very well, the wife of, the model of, something that in this direction. So
it's really interesting, because I think that's what I wanted to do when I set out to do all my projects, is actually, it's this idea that it's, the book is called The Story of Art Without Men, but it's really not to erase men from art history at all, I promise. In the sense that it's just about saying, well, if this is the story of art without women, essentially, let's bring this up to here. And I was so fed up as well of museums constantly in their tiny little 50-word label you know, saying that this person was the wife of, or the muse of, or the daughter of, or the sister of. It was actually the Lee Krasner exhibition at the Barbican Centre in London a few years ago, which really made me think about this, because Lee Krasner was an extraordinary artist, born 1908, New York City, to a Jewish immigrant family in Brooklyn. And she set her sights on being one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. And she found the only high school in New York City where she could travel 1 hour from Brooklyn to Manhattan each day so she could attend. She made work that was 6 meters long, these extraordinary abstract masterpieces, and went on to have this incredible, you know, 6-decade career. In 2019, the Barbican show was her first ever, since the 60s, major survey of her work. And so many times, especially headlines, had called her Mrs. Jackson Pollock, because she was married to Jackson Pollock. And what this exhibition did was it actually centered her as her. And it was extraordinary because, yes, of course he contributed to her work and he was part of her life, but that doesn't have to define her at all. If anything, and actually earlier this year I made a whole series about this, was the fact how also she helped his career so much. So many people don't know that she was the one who introduced him to the galleries, who taught him about European art, who secured his legacy after he killed himself crashing his car with the woman he was having an affair with's friend. And what also she did, which people don't know, is how much she also secured his market legacy. So we know about these stratospheric prices with the abstract expressionist artists now, but back then they were, you know, they had $200 in the bank when Pollock died. And what Lee Krasner did was actually she played MoMA and the Met off against each other. And she raised the price from $10,000 to $30,000 overnight. And that was her doing. That was her literally playing these museums off against each other. So not only was this incredible woman, an artist, someone who created communities, someone who secured market, but I think we've got to look at the kind of three-dimensionality of it as well and not just reduce her to that. Last year I actually got the New York Times to change their obituary headline for Françoise Gillot because she died aged 101, extraordinary artist for 8 decades. Yet they said that she was the muse and mistress, which was completely false, of Picasso. And it's so dangerous to talk about these people in this way because, first of all, not only is it respectful, but it's a very disrespectful. It's a very sort of cheap way of doing that. And actually, if we constantly are searching for these clickbaiting headlines, oh, woman, you know, contemporary of Caravaggio, no, say her name. Because actually, the public are smarter than you think. And the public want to know these names, I think.
Yeah. And it's a lot of community too, so that's what we talked about this morning, community building. So to get into a certain scene of artists, male or female. And another interesting thing is, so I'm still thinking on the 16th century, at the beginning, the female artists have been daughters of artists. So they have been daughters. And they have been integrated into a male-dominated world of rulers, of art collectors, of dealers. So how did you deal with this in your portrayal of women artists? Is it possible to ignore this part of the world?
Well, I think, you know, it's never to erase men entirely. And actually, if there is something that's significant about them, so for example, Artemisia Gentileschi, who was one of the most extraordinary Baroque artists born in 1593, worked throughout the 1610s, the 1640s. And, you know, the only way she was able to become an artist was because of her father. Her mother died very young and she was tasked with raising her younger siblings, and they grew up in her father's studio. And because she had access to his work, she was able to copy it. And that's how these women learned. And so I think it's important to definitely recognize that if it's necessary. I think it's about making sure that we don't define them by it, because if you still go to the Uffizi today, before they even say the word or the words Artemisia Gentileschi, they talk about Orazio Gentileschi and Caravaggio. And actually, it's like I said just before, it's it's not okay, because we have to make sure we center these people as people and see their work for the splendor that it is.
Yeah. That's right. So I think it's quite interesting following the process that we are still discovering the oeuvre of female artists. So like in the case of Artemisia Gentileschi, a lot of paintings from Artemisia had been given to her father because he was the famous painter. So, but she learned in the studio of her father, and more and more we discover that she had a really big oeuvre work. And this is going on also with other artists. So I think more and more we can fill books with a story of art without men.
Can I say one thing? I mean, it's so interesting that, because you think about how many books are written on women artists versus how many books are written on Michelangelo alone.
That's right.
And the thing is, there is just so much more research that has gone into these male artists. And so I think it's always, if there are any students in the room, you know, it's such an exciting time because there's so much uncharted territory. You know, there's so much to discover. And that is also why we're just seeing some of these works by these women artists in history come to light now, because of people like Mary Garrard, who is one of the world experts on Artemisia Gentileschi, has understood how we see her hand in painting. And also, you know, there are so many cases as well, because there's also a reason why women artists' work were attributed to male artists, and that's also because of the market. So, for example, in 1917, there was an incident with the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York where they bought a painting for $200,000, which they thought was by the neoclassical artist Jacques-Louis David. And actually, as time went on, and you know, critics described this as exemplary and unforgettable and what a perfect work. And as time went on, they actually found out that it was by one of his students, a woman called Marie Denis Villers. And actually, critics kind of took back their ideas and said, actually, it doesn't have the kind of caliber, the hand that David would have had, or all these things. I mean, it's ridiculous. But why I'm saying that is because, you know, especially in the 19th century, art dealers would actually scratch out a woman artist's name and replace it with a male artist because it was easier to sell. And if that's your job, then maybe that's the consequences that you've got to take. And, you know, even today, though, we're still reeling from this in the sense that, on average, women artists' work go for just 10% of a male artist's work. You know, the highest fetching work to have gone at auction is Georgia O'Keeffe, Jimson Weed Flower, for $44.4 million, compared to Leonardo Salvador Mundi, do we even know it's by him, for $450 million. And so, you know, and time again, you know, Modigliani's, Picasso's, they go for those hundreds of millions of dollars, but there's still so much work to do, and it's almost as though the art world acts as a microcosm for the way that we place value on genders in society. So I think it's all about, you know, making sure we acknowledge this and actually do something about it.
So we all know these rankings, prices for the art market, and I don't know them very well, but I know that within the first 100 artists, there are maybe 10, 15 women. Not more. So the most expensive artists are still men. So so the question is, who is collecting? Who has the money? So I think there are more and more also female museum directors, if they have the money to buy it all. So it's another question.
But I think that's really interesting because, you know, for the first time ever in history, have we had women at the helm of some of these museums. For the first time ever, we've got a female director of the Tate, Maria Balshaw. And if you look at the exhibitions that have taken place under her premiership, they've been extraordinary. Women in Revolt, an extraordinary exhibition about 70s and 80s Britain, about social change in Britain, the women of the Greenham Common and banners and all these fantastic things. Kind of artwork that was not considered artwork by the establishment, who saw the kind of, you know, the hierarchy of art forms, painting and sculpture at the top and sort of embroidery and whatever at the bottom. Or you have a look at what they've got as well on at the moment called Now You See Us, an exhibition of women artists for the last 400 years, 1520 to 1920. And it's this kind of rewriting of art history. And what's extraordinary is that, and it's not to say that male directors don't do this, because I know many museum male directors who are very conscious of this, but for the first time, the fact that we're seeing a different perspective, I think that's what it's all about, because if you're not seeing art by a wide range of people, then you're not seeing society as a whole. And if those who are behind the scenes as well aren't from a wide range of backgrounds, then also that story is not going to be told in the proper way. And also, at the end of the day, you're just missing out on great art and ideas and perspectives.
Yeah, no, it's quite interesting following all these processes. But I also am wondering, did you get any reactions of your male colleagues, male artists? What is, are you discussing with them too, or?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think, you know, people sort of, the title of the book always gets a bit of a laugh, because it is meant to be tongue-in-cheek. And maybe people roll their eyes, I don't know. But actually, at the end of the day, the statistics don't lie. You know, this book was written really in a reaction to Gombrich's Story of Art, which is a book I read and loved growing up. I'm sure many of you know this very well, since he's Viennese. But his Story of Art, when it was first published in 1950, included 0 women artists. And only the 16th edition, which is my copy, included just one, the great German expressionist Käthe Kollwitz. But clearly that's not enough. And also, if we think about, you know, the reason why I'm doing these audio guides for museums is because the statistics are still shocking. In London, the National Gallery dedicates just 1% of its collection to women artists. The Royal Academy of Arts in London, an institution that has been open since 1768. It took 255 years last year for them to put on their first ever solo exhibition by a female artist in their main galleries. And so if you're someone who doesn't have an art background and you don't know where to start, and you start with museums, these are the public-facing entry points for the public, right? And if they're not giving you a full story, then you probably just think, oh, well, then women artists didn't exist. And that entire history is erased. And actually, it's you know, and interestingly, the National Gallery, I'm not saying this is the reason, but maybe it is, their visitor numbers are falling. And actually, these museums need to make themselves relevant. And what is relevant now are stories from all these different perspectives. And I just think, if anything, they're just missing out on a great, not even trick, I mean, it's just a great history that should be explored now and is being explored by a lot of museums around the world.
I follow you completely. So we have some minutes before we are opening the discussions to the audience. But as we are sitting here in the Academy of Fine Arts of Vienna, we are educating a lot of young artists, more women than men. So what would you recommend? I know there are some artists here in the audience, and what would you recommend, knowing the scene so well, knowing the stories of women so well, what would you recommend at the beginning of a career, of should they make a kind of career plan, or what should they do? What's the most important thing that you noticed, that you discovered within your studies?
I think the best thing you can do is build communities, and build communities in so many different ways. And if you are artists, or maybe you're art historians, or you want to be curators, put on a show together. And also never be precious about where that show takes place. All experience is good experience. And you know, my first exhibition, the first exhibition I put on when I was 23, was in a foyer of an advertising agency. And I put on a show of 15 of my friends. And it was so much fun. And actually, you know, although it was in an advertising agency, 1,000 people came on opening night, and I made a press release, and I did the accounts, and it taught me how to hang pictures and title a show and all these different things. And so I always think, if you're at that, whatever stage you are at in your career, never be precious about where you're doing something, and work with like-minded people to champion them, you know, because some of these artists who were in that show I now work with on a museum level. You never sort of know where it's going to end up. And I think if anything we can learn from so many of these extraordinary people in the past, you know, the Impressionists.
Yeah.
So now one of the most famous movements in history, but they were excluded from the salon. And so they took to their friend's photography studio. And that's where they had their first ever exhibition in 1874, because they weren't accepted by the Academy. And so I think it's all about saying, well, if it doesn't matter if the Academy don't accept it, if you believe what you're doing is important, then start something. Yeah. And I think always work together. No one got anywhere on their own. And I think, you know, to be an artist is to sort of be an artist for life. I mean, it's not the kind of job that you do where you're going to sort of change different positions. And so I think it's about just getting as much experience as possible and seeing as much as possible. And if you do have access to maybe your school corridors and your university, put on a show there, because also you never know who's going to see it, you never know what it might teach you, and you never know what can become of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So about community building, you also told me that you're going to schools, telling children a story of art, of female artists. So I think that's also a very important thing. I also made my very first experiences in my school. So this is not only the academy, but we also have to start earlier with the education of children. So to make beware what will rest, what's the important thing in art history too.
Definitely, I think, yeah.
Okay, so maybe I have no more questions. So we open the discussion now to you. So we have a micro in the room, and we start with the gentleman here.
Art histories are often written following the historic influence of one artist on his or her time. As an art teacher, I'm trained to say this is an artist who was very important because he gave rise to this and that movement. This is not possible when writing a female art history, because their accomplishments were not valued or known. How do you deal with this?
Well, I also would say that, you know, I've divided this book into categories and movements, purely for ease for the reader. And I always say that artists are not the products of movements, but movements are the products of artists who have long, expanding, ever expanding careers. And I think that, you know, what I do in this book as well is that also acknowledge that the women were there, whether they were participating in the Impressionist exhibition, whether they were being shown in the Baroque movement, whether they were founding members of the Royal Academy in the neoclassical times, they were there. You know, in the 1768 portrait by Johann Zoffany, this incredible portrait of the 36 founding members of the Royal Academy in London, 2 were women, Angelica Kaufmann and Mary Moser. And you see this extraordinary picture of all the men in suits dressed around this, you know, surrounded by this nude body. And actually the women are hardly visible in portrait busts in the wall. And you think, oh my God, you know, this is insane, this exclusion. But at the same time, they were there. Just because they weren't written about or sort of being given the same opportunities doesn't mean that they didn't try just as hard or even harder. And so I think that, you know, in a way this answer is twofold. I think they absolutely were there, but I also think that it's also important to guide art history by artists and also styles as well. So, you know, I look at artists, for example, who may not have been sort of part of movements as such. It's more about their presence. They were here. You know, they were alive during World War II and what they created from that. People like Charlotte Solomon, who I don't know ever had an exhibition in her life, but created one of the most extraordinary works of art of all time called Life or Theatre, made up of 768 gouaches, which is essentially a kind of tale or a story or a comic book sort of thing, although that reduces it, about her life. What was it like growing up in Nazi Germany as a young Jewish German girl? And so it's about sort of expanding our idea of the canon. And just because they didn't tackle entire ceilings doesn't mean that they aren't worthy of being included in the history of art. And this idea of greatness as well. What is great art? Embroidery can be great art. If anything, embroidery can reveal a deep political subtext from hundreds of years and actually can be such an interesting way to teach art history.
Good. Okay.
I wanted to ask you about the book. How is the structure in the book? And if your focus is on the biography and socialization on the artists, or do you doing also an analysis of the works and content? Thank you.
It's a great question. So the book is divided into 5 parts. Part 1 is 1500 to 1900, and it's the smallest part, regrettably, because there is not enough scholarship out there. Part 2 is 1900 to 1945, so around the world, sort of during the wars, I guess. Part 3 is post-war, so it's post-war up until 1970, so minimalism, abstraction, performance art, the body, abstract expressionism, the fiber art movement that erupted in the 60s. And then part 4 is 1970 to 2000, so really this kind of feminism, the women's liberation movement, second wave feminism, and its effect on that. And then part 5 is 2000s to the present day. It's called Still Writing the Story of Art because we don't know what story we're living in at the moment. And to your point, there is elements of biography, there are elements of analysis. It brings in the artist's voice, it brings in scholars' voices. I've tried to sort of paint a picture, as well-rounded picture as possible. And really, this book is I hope it's for everyone, in the sense that you don't even have to have stepped inside a museum to read this book. And I think that's very important because I think that everyone's got to start somewhere. And I would hope that people of all very illustrious professorship level would enjoy it, but also the general person, because again, if this history has been erased for so long, then we need to create, I believe that we need to create resources that is going to include as many people as possible.
So I have to say it's really nice to read. It's very elegant. It's easy to read. It's really it opens you so many views to this female artist. And in this sense, it's really like the book of Gombrich. The Gombrich's book, The Story of Art, has been translated in, I think, about 20 languages, but Katy's book already is translated in 17 languages. You can imagine. It's really incredible. I couldn't believe it because we are teaching here in our bubbles, academies, and discussing on conferences. And her book and her podcast and her Instagram account reaches so many people. That's really amazing. So can we please, there was a lady in the, okay, so
just a short question. It relates to the book and your project. Gender fluidity has become part of the public consciousness. As part of your research, have you discovered cases of women who identified as men historically, so their art could be, so they could do art?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. This book, I should add that I've called it The Story of Art Without Men as well, to be as inclusive as possible, so non-binary artists, trans artists. And interestingly, I mean, I don't know if it was for that reason, but I have a whole chapter on queer identities in the early 1900s, where these extraordinary artists dressed very androgynously, and they made work about queer culture, they made work about queer identity in ways that we now have the language for, but back then we didn't. And so I think it's extraordinary to look back 100 years and see how groundbreaking these people were. People like Claude Cahun, an extraordinary photographer who played with identity and how they looked. And I've worked with a lot of queer scholars on making the language very sensitive and to make it as inclusive as possible. But I don't, Rosa Bonheur in the 1800s, in the 1850s, made an extraordinary work which is in the Met's collection called The Horse Fair. And actually, and you know, like I said, women artists didn't have access to the life room until much later in the 1800s, but they could have access to animals. And so she was this extraordinary animal painter. And in order to go to the horse fair, she actually had to get a license from the police to wear trousers to disguise her identity. So that's probably an example.
Thank you so much for your work. A short reflection and a question. When you mentioned the 1% statistic of gallery space being dedicated to women artists, I immediately thought of the parallel where globally less than 1%, or maybe at the most only 30% of the land in a given country is owned exclusively by women. And so I think about the different perspectives that we might see, the different worlds that we might see in art, as well as how we relate to the earth, if these percentages change. And so the question is, for you, I would like to hear you talk about a piece of work that you encountered that completely blew your mind, completely changed how you thought about the world, how you saw the world, etc. Thank you.
It's a great reflection and really interesting. I think a work that maybe blew my mind was a work by Artemisia Gentileschi, and it's called Susanna and the Elders. And Susanna and the Elders follows the very famous Old Testament story of a young, virtuous woman who's bathing in her garden when two lecherous men try and abuse her. And it is ubiquitous in the history of art because it allows for the semi-naked Susanna. So you go into most European-focused galleries and there will be a Susanna and the Elders. And so much of the time, Susanna is idealized and sexualized and, you know, yeah, exactly, and objectified. And actually it's sort of seen as a scene of coyness rather than torment, right? And it's a violent scene. And what Artemisia Gentileschi does in 1611 is she paints that story from the perspective of a woman. And she understands that women go through this, all sorts of people go through this in the world, but she paints it from the perspective of the person who has been violated. And I think that blew my mind because it opened up the fact how important it is to have different perspectives. And then, you know, fast forward to the 2000s, and we have a Colombian artist called Doris Salcedo, who was working on a scale bigger than this. And in Istanbul in 2003, Doris Salcedo grew up in the 50s in Colombia at the time of the Civil War. And she talks about this idea of always creating art from the perspective of the victim, the perspective of the innocent. And she made this incredible installation where she stacked and shoved 1,500 chairs between these two buildings on an unassuming street in Istanbul. And when we see this, it's in the book, but when we see this installation, if you can imagine it, you can only see it if you look at the installation front on. You can't see it from the side, and you can maybe see it from above, if you can. And what she does is she makes us think about the chair and the fact that we're all sitting on chairs today, and what happens when all of that is taken away and all of that life is taken away. And what she does is she almost shows us a sort of mass grave and what the world has done to so many innocent people. And because she shows us it from the perspective of the innocent, it changes our view entirely if we think about the wars happening right now. What about the innocent? What about the victim? The COVID-19 pandemic, what about the people who lost their life? You know, all that. And so I think it's what art can do. It can't actually change the world, but it can change people's minds. And by offering someone a different perspective, can actually maybe change the world.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I just have a short question, if it's okay, about your Instagram account, because I wanted to ask, why did you choose a photo of Georgia O'Keeffe as the profile picture?
Honestly, it was when I couldn't sleep and I was in bed and I was 21. And I honestly think it was the first picture I saw on Google. And it just remained that. And it's something, I don't know why. I mean, you know, she is obviously one of the greatest artists ever to have lived. But I just found it, and I almost think that, so the Instagram is called The Great Women Artists, which takes its name from a famous essay that was written in 1971 by a great scholar called Linda Nochlin. It was called Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, which really catalyzed the feminist movement in the 70s. And so I thought of that name off the top of my head in a moment, and I thought of the picture, and I just stuck with it.
So I have to say, when you mentioned Linda Nochlin, some years ago, it was 2021, we had here on AKADEMIE a big conference about women art historians. And this was 50 years after Linda Nochlin, and our title was, Why Have There Been No Great Female Art Historians? Because the same thing happened to art historians. 15 years ago, there was a book about the most famous art historians, 2 books, maybe 20, 30 art historians, but no woman. All men, so the same question is also very important in our field, and there's really a lot of work to do. So maybe go to another question, please.
I came here today to to say hello to Katy and to thank her how profoundly she inspired us while we were working on an exhibition at the Belvedere dedicated to women artists. But now I think, since we all seem to share the belief, and our belief is to make women's art visible, I want to invite you to come to our exhibition next year in summer at the Belvedere. We are going to bring about 70 women artists, which you all might know from Katy's book. You can see their work. Their work is groundbreaking. I think you're going to love it, so please come to our show. I will be happy to guide you. I will do everything to do so. And yes, I'm glad I had the chance to hear you again, Katy.
Oh, it's going to be extraordinary. I think that is so important. You know, a book is its own thing, and it has reproductive images, but there is nothing like seeing the work in person. And I think the fact that, you know, the Belvedere, one of the oldest and most renowned institutions, not just in Vienna, but around the world, to give that space. And I think the young people walking in, and they'll see that as the norm, and I think it's very important. So thanks for your work.
Okay, yeah.
Can I make, okay. Hi, Katy. I'm actually not from the art scene. I'm a music librarian, and where I work in a university, we make the effort to buy a lot of scores from music composed by women. We want to bring definitely more diversity to our collection, but there is a problem. We buy everything, but it's never borrowed. Nobody comes for those editions. And nobody can answer me. Maybe there is an equivalent in the art world. Maybe exhibitions by women artists, they receive less visitors as exhibition by male artists. I'm not sure, but what would you suggest? How can we motivate people to consume more art made by women?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's fantastic that you have, the library is so lucky to have people like you to be focusing on that. You know, the truth of the matter is that this book shouldn't have been written. It shouldn't have been written because it shouldn't need to have been written, right? I shouldn't be here today because, in a way, what should have happened, I hoped, from all of our predecessors is the fact that they would have celebrated people of all kind and they would have given opportunities to everyone. But sadly, we live in a world where there's a lot of work to do, to undo that, to unlearn, to relearn all these amazing artists. And so what I would say to you is that sometimes you have to make these women-focused exhibitions or these women-focused books in order to get that into public consciousness. And I don't know whether there's a way that in your library, I haven't been, but maybe you could make a display or a special newsletter or a special series of talks dedicated to the women musicians. And, you know, about 3 people came to my first talk. And but obviously you're very kind to all come today. But, you know, but you've already got this incredible platform, and so I think use it and, you know, make a celebration out of it. Maybe, you know, March, it's International Women's Month, and you could do a month of women in music. And so it's about saying, okay, how can we, maybe this, we're talking about this in the public consciousness right now, or maybe it's Hildegard of Bingen's 1000th birthday of something coming up. And so you know, focus on that, and you have to almost spotlight it and concentrate it in order for people, in order for it to have a ripple effect.
Okay. So finally, okay. In your research on women artists throughout the ages, as it were, did you have the feeling that women are drawn by different topics? Are they attracted by different topics from men? And if so, do you think this had any bearing on their acceptance?
Oh, that's such a brilliant question. You know, in a way, I don't know if there's any difference about art created by different genders. It's more the fact that the gatekeepers and those who have told the history of art have told us that we have to abide by certain subjects and certain rules. So, for example, take motherhood, right? What's the most, motherhood, the Madonna and Child is one of the most ubiquitous subjects in art history. Yet it's always sort of been from a male point of view if we think about the Madonna and Child. Yet when an artist in the 70s creates a work about motherhood from her stockings and tights because she's just had a baby and she doesn't know how her body is expanding and contracting, it's not shown. And so I think it's less to do with the subjects and more to do with those people who are on the other end of that line, and they're saying what's right and what's wrong. And I think we're now living in this moment of reckoning where we're blowing open all these different subjects and perspectives. And so I think that, yeah, I mean, it's about the human experience, I guess, and there are so many in art history, and I guess it's the perspective again.
Another question here, and yeah.
Thanks. I would like to try an experiment, or I have a question for the audience. How many of us are artists in this room? I would like to know, because I haven't recognized any colleague of mine. I'm studying at this academy, and I find it really unsettling that nobody just came to this legendary lecture. Really, like, are you all academy students?
Yeah.
But artists? Yeah, okay. Just wanted to let it register in the history, because I see that like it's being recorded. And I want to thank you especially for this opportunity. I'm really happy that you are here, Katy. I'm fascinated by your work. I'm like the podcast and everything, like the book, amazing. I have a question, like how do you deal with the offended people who don't have the same understanding about feminism or about like patriarchy and about the inequalities that people were experiencing over the years, over the centuries? I'm an artist studying here, and I am a queer person, and I actually don't, I'm non-binary, but I don't want to like even like make this distinctive situation of like man and woman and whatever. I have a lot of cis men best friends, and you know, like I connect with a lot of people that have the same understanding of the values I have, or like feminism. But I feel like there is a lack, even at the academy, of understanding these things. And then I'm a bit like, from time to time, during some specific situations, like I'm really shocked that what I'm trying to say is not understood at all. Like I was told twice by a professor here that in the meantime, there are like
3/4.
3/4, thanks. 3/4 of the academy students are women, and in the meantime there are more female professors at the academy teaching, and I don't know how to answer to this comment, you know, like I can't, what is your tool to cope with this, like with offended, mostly men, but also women, who are just like pointing out this kind of stuff, if you are calling someone out for their violent behavior or whatever, you know, like in a relevant scenario, relevant situation, what would you do if you would like, if you would hear something like that, like?
I think that, you know, I mean, I have been told many times that certain things won't work, you know, and I have been rejected 1,000 times in so many work situations, and I've said, no, but it's a really good idea, I promise. And actually I think what you've got to do is just believe in yourself, and I think that if someone thinks that way, then how do I show them? How do I teach someone to see another point of view? And I think, you know, as an artist, you can do that. And I think that's the power of art, is that it can change people's minds. And similarly with this, you know, the reason why I made this book is because it was to say that there's a huge issue here and we need to address this. And rather than me sort of, you know, I don't know, going up to the National Gallery director and shouting at him, whatever, I'm going to say, here you go, have a read, see what you think. And so it's more like you kind of make these things. It's almost to show people the answers, I guess. And to just do it in your way as well, in ways that you feel work for you. Because if they think that way, then that's their issue, not yours.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you to Elisabeth.
So, thank you so much for this beautiful hour. It was so important hour for all the interesting questions, and we know what we have to do. So it's really a lot of work for every one of us, everyone who is sitting here, and thank you for your so important work. And I'm sure it's not the last time we will work together. And thank you so much. All the best, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone.